and thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our podcast and have a recommendation about someone you think we should have on to share their voice and journey with the world, by all means, let us know. It could be an aid worker, monastic, author, journalist, scholar, resistance leader, really anyone with some tie or another to the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To offer up a name, go to our website, insightmyanmar.org, and let us know. But for now, just sit back and take a listen to today's episode.
A lack of conscience is all it takes to diagnose yourself with ignorance.
Welcome back. My guest tonight is someone who has done quite a bit of research on the NUG and has recently had an article published posing and answering the question, is the NUG ready to govern? So I'd like to thank you very much for coming to speak to us about this topic. I know it's going to be a little bit controversial, but I think it's a very important topic to discuss, and I'm very pleased that you're here to discuss it with us. I'd like to give you an opportunity to explain to the audience who you are and what it is that you do.
Happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Philipp Annawitt. As you said, I've published this article in the Diplomat. I have been working in Myanmar for a number of years, for the UN first. Now I work independently. Since the coup in 2021, I've been an advisor to a number of development partners on their programming, and have been in touch with many stakeholders inside the NUG, also the CRPH. And that experience was the basis of the article that you've read, and on the basis of which you've invited me to be with you today.
Okay, so let's just jump straight into this. So the article itself, and I've got the article in front of me, and it's not particularly long. We will link it below this episode so that people can read through it. But the ultimate conclusion that you come to is that the National Unity Government fundamentally is in a position to be ready to govern, and that the National Unity Government has met most or all of the requirements that under conventional circumstances would be applied to an organization claiming to be a legitimate government and claiming to be a functional government. So can you just take us through the basic arguments that you're making for why you think the NUG meets the criteria for validity, why it meets the criteria for functionality, and why on the whole you think you can confidently state that the National Unity Government is ready to govern?
Right. So when we think about governments from a functional perspective, not from a legal perspective now, then there's certain expectations that we and also the international community has had of governments, of what they need to do. And many of these functions is I would argue, are being performed by the NUG as we speak. So the NUG has certain capacities to act. There is what we call a center of government, meaning the NUG has an established center that coordinates its activities across its different portfolios, be it health, be it education support, and that center exercises a modicum of control. It has a decision-making mechanism. It has a cabinet that functions. There's reporting on activities by the individual ministries going on. So all this is in place. There's a financial control framework that's in place. While rudimentary, all of that is in place. And then, of course, there's the big question of control, of presence on the ground, of loyalty on the ground. And I don't think we have to discuss the political loyalties, the support that the NUG as an institution and as a member of a much broader democratic coalition in Myanmar enjoys from the people. That's not something we have to discuss in much detail, I assume, because it's plenty documented. And then, yeah, you wanted to come in?
So you note that there is a distinction to be made between the National Unity Government as the cabinet entity, which is a comparatively small body. I think it has some 22 cabinet members, something along those lines, versus the much broader sort of trappings of state. So we have this organization, the CRPH, we have this organization, the NUCC. There is a much larger political entity at play, which is larger than the cabinet itself. And then, of course, we have a much broader pro-democracy, let's say, context, the pro-democracy movement, pro-democracy forces in general across the country. So for the benefit of specificity, what exactly is it that you're talking about when you're talking about the services that the NUG provides, the control that it has, and so on?
Right. So we're talking really about the functions of an executive government, and those are, if we should list them, maybe in the beginning, you have the central coordination that we've already discussed. The idea that there is control of resources, public financial management, money going in, public money being spent is controlled and coordinated to a degree. Public administration, meaning that there is a certain control of A, planning of services that are delivered, and B, how is the state administered. In the case of Myanmar, in very important local administration and service delivery. And local administration, of course, is the most dynamic, and I think we'll talk about it later, but it's the most dynamic field of invention in Myanmar, where there's strong contestation between the NUG and its ally-supported structures vis-à-vis the atrophying, I would say, local administration of the State Administrative Council, the junta government. Then there is international relations, and also how aid is being managed. Usually is a criterion, right? So that you have a coordination as a government on how the international community acts with you, and how aid is being used. And then there is of course, the security sector, especially the civilian security sector, the question of providing security on the ground, police forces, and the provision of justice. And across these functions, of course, the performance of the NUG varies, but the NUG is active across all these functions, and its activities are expanding vis-à-vis the SAC, whereas the SAC's activities are actually receding across these functions. And so you have a government that is an executive government, and that is capable of acting as an executive government.
And so an important sort of result of this, and I know that this may be a little bit outside of your wheelhouse. I respect it if it's not something that you can really comment on, but I'd be curious to hear your insights. Normally, when we have a government that meets these pragmatic standards of legitimacy and of efficacy, we would begin to see international recognition and acceptance. And to date, the NUG has received very limited recognition and acceptance. Can you think of any reasons with regard to the NUG's actual functions, the NUG's actual performance to date, that foreign countries would be hesitant to recognize them as a legitimate government?
I think, there's a number of reasons that you can think about. I would suggest, of course, there are some related to the functions and the degree of control of the NUG, which is very fluid in terms of how much territory is controlled, to which degree territory is controlled. The matter of the fact is, if you look at the administration of the NUG, that it is, and I think that's the only example that I can think of, at least in what history I know, of a volunteer administration. So the NUG is powered by the CDM, so the civil disobedience movement, which are striking civil servants that are aligned with it, where the NUG provides support to them. But these are not, across the country, people who are officially providing their services. And in many areas, security is still contested, so it's messy, right? There's competing claims on who controls which territory. So that's one reason, right? The second reason I would think is, and that's my very private view, is geopolitics. The fact that Myanmar is on the fault line of a geopolitical conflict that is building up. And we have in China somebody who has, to this point, been a bit invested with the junta, makes it more difficult to take sides openly for any foreign powers, I think. And then there's also, I think, the history of premature recognitions that we've had.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. I think this is something that seems to come in very often, and it's something that is just a thorn in the side of progress. And I know this is a little bit off topic, but when we look at things like the PDF, when we look at the NUG, when we look at the movement in Myanmar in general, it's very difficult to. It feels like cognitive dissonance almost on the side of major powers when they say we want progress and we want to support progressive movements and organizations and governments, while simultaneously politicians are aware of the fact that 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, if they were associated with the support for XYZ organization, and it later came to light that that organization was embezzling or was connected to unsavory organizations or was connected to crimes, then they will lose political capital in their home countries. And that seems to be hamstringing, from my perspective anyway, hamstringing the will among parliamentarians and among political movers and shakers in many Western countries who don't want to be caught supporting someone when that may turn very sour. I mean, the United States selling weapons to Iran in order to raise capital to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, is a very good example of just how much things can blow up in your face. So what, if anything, can the NUG be doing to overcome these things? I think we could say that these are not necessarily the National Unity Government's fault, but is there anything that they should be doing or could be doing to overcome these barriers?
Two things, I guess to say here. One is that while recognition needs to be, of course, and is a major objective by the NUG, non-recognition on the part of potential sympathetic countries, Western countries, democracies in Asia, and so on, isn't really an excuse anymore for a lack of support. So I think we can talk about both things. What the NUG can do to or get closer to the eventual goal of recognition would be to maybe use a bit better what limited resources they have, and resources are limited. Of course, there's the diaspora that is very much linked into what the NUG does in many countries, and mobilizing the diaspora has been a success story for the NUG, both in terms of their fundraising and also in terms of advocacy and relations with the media in different countries abroad. And so the NUG has these representative offices, and these representative offices, I know it from the ones that are relevant to, or that are active in my home region. And these are very, very active, right? There's a lot of communication going out of these offices. They're usually forwarding messaging that comes from the center. But I believe that investment in the capacity of these offices to do more and to be more strategic in communication, to observe maybe better what would consider diplomatic protocol would go a long way. So that's an area where investment could help, I think, because all these meetings, they're very good, and sustained engagement is good, and especially in the US with the ambassador to the UN, there's a very strong representation, and that I think is showing success. But apart from that, these one-off meetings by ministers, be it the foreign minister, be it the Minister of Human Rights or other ministers, they're good in creating goodwill, but in terms of seeing progress on sustained engagement, and seeing progress on support and in cooperation, you need more sustained engagement. And that is usually done by somebody who's on the ground in the country and can really, try and reach out to the government institutions of the partner country in a sustained manner, and can also try to influence how media report on the issue. Because let's face it, Myanmar is not on the radar of many countries that are potentially sympathetic, and even where it's on the radar, it's not a top priority outside maybe of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, absolutely, and definitely, the war in Ukraine has drawn a lot of attention and goodwill. Yeah. Iran now is on the rise, although as a counterpoint to that, I think the outpouring of aid and how should I put this? Just unilateral decisions to send aid and support by individual countries to Ukraine as it defends itself against Russian aggression shows that it is very much within the remit of Western powers to say we will unilaterally recognize this government and we will assist this government in establishing order and democracy and peace. The money is clearly there. The political will to do these things is clearly there. They don't need the approval of their fellow states. And yet, when the context is Myanmar, they don't seem to be particularly willing to act. There isn't as much eagerness, even though with the outpouring that happened for the Ukrainian cause, I think with a tenth of that, huge strides could have been made in Myanmar. The war might already have been brought to an end. But
yes,
that is international politics, unfortunately. That's just what we have to deal with.
It is. Just the one thing that actually brings us maybe back to what I said before, which is, so if you leave aside the question of recognition, the limited support that the NUG has been getting from international partners is really, to me, not defensible. So you're right, there is this outpouring of support, and you see it in official statements from everybody who's basically been involved in the West. The EU is very strong with their statements. There have been parliamentary resolutions in a number of parliaments. Some Asian democracies are very strong. In Southeast Asia, Malaysia has been very supportive, and yet actual support has been very, very limited. And you don't need recognition to support. Yeah, there are other ways of doing it that are below the threshold of recognition, and that is something, or the lack of that is something that is actually, I find more in my personal view, more infuriating than the lack of progress on recognition per se.
Absolutely, and at the end of the day, any opportunity that we are not taking to help the victims of war crimes is reprehensible, right? When we have the chance to help, we should be. Now, I want to take it back a little bit, because you made a comment when we were talking about the foreign policy and the messaging. You made comment that the resources of the National Unity Government are very limited, and that, I think, is an objective truth. But people, I think, don't really understand so much how the finances work here. You also alluded to the fact that this is a volunteer force, a volunteer government. And by government in this case, I mean not only cabinet, but also effectively a volunteer civil service. Yes. Which in any administration is going to be large. And we are talking about a country of some 54 million people, larger than any European country except Russia, obviously. And the administration required to run something of that scale, particularly in a time of conflict, is enormous. So can you shed a little bit more light on what the finances are like when you say volunteer force? Exactly what does that mean? How much is volunteer? How much is compensated? What's sort of going on there?
So the way it currently works is that whatever resources that are mobilized by the NUG go either into the support of the CDM, meaning those striking civil servants, whether they're actually used for active service delivery or not. Some are not everybody is being used. It's a question of volunteering, right? Some people are comfortable because, a CDM staff that perform services in areas that aren't under full control, they do that at significant personal risk and risk to their families. So a lot of resources that are incoming are spent on supporting the physical needs and livelihoods of these people. And it's by no means is that adequate. What's incoming is not adequate. It's currently the prerogative of each ministry, or the duty of each ministry, to care about their CDM staff, right? So it's their role to do that. In terms of what that is the administration. That's, if you will, that's the public administration. That is the civil service of the NUG. There's not yet a regulatory framework around that civil service. And it may be too early to do that, but in the future, as they progress, that is probably also a priority that needs to be tackled. But beyond or above that civil service, there's, of course, the cabinet, and then there's people that work with and around the ministers. There's, if you want, the head office of the ministries, and these vary in size. Can be a few people, can be larger, can be dozens of people, and also these people are all volunteers. There are no salaries, there are no living allowances, because what money comes in really, and I have to say, a spirit of self-sacrifice is used to support CDMers, and to a certain degree, of course, what resources come in are being used to support the military and defense effort against the Myanmar military. And that is currently the situation. And apart from that, what other resources are available are used for service delivery. and that means running schools, providing health services, sometimes mobile health services, sometimes these famous bush clinics, and to support the livelihood of the large numbers of internally displaced people.
So a lot of calls on the purse strings of the National Unity Government, certainly. And I mean, the fact that this is coming from the people themselves, from the communities themselves, is, I mean, it's very difficult to imagine people who are already facing such hardship being able to make those types of contributions and regularly making those types of contributions. But one then would have to surmise that the amount of money that the Myanmar people themselves can raise for the support of the National Unity Government would be very limited indeed. Like, it does not.
Well, a lot of it comes also from the diaspora. So you can't underestimate the impact that funding from the diaspora. And diaspora, the Myanmar diaspora is in many countries around the world, as you know, has. But also, the diaspora, many of these people are also people that live on modest incomes. So let's not forget that. So whatever it is, everybody sacrifices.
And so, like, with regards to the money, there's one thing that does stand out to me, and I don't know whether you'd be able to shed light on what's going on there, but the Ministry of Planning and Finance and Investment has run a series of these, I don't know how to describe them. They're investments into the future. So they will take land, or they will take property. We saw the End of Dictatorship Initiative, so they would take Min Aung Hlaing's mansion, which he acquired quite, questionably anyway, on Inya Lake, and they split that into a series of shares, and they were selling shares in the mansion, and now they've announced investment projects, and they're selling off shares in investment opportunities in Mandalay. Who is it who's actually buying that? Like, are there Western sort of investment companies who are leaping at these opportunities, or is that also Myanmar people and Myanmar diaspora?
I don't have that information. I honestly would be surprised if it wasn't the same sort of people buying that, the diaspora and Myanmar people. I think it's a very smart strategy. The legal claims, of course, will be, it'd be very risky for any Western company to buy that. In terms of investment strategy, that's probably not what Western companies would do. But what we have to say is that the Ministry of Planning, Finance, Investment has been very ingenious in identifying opportunities and modalities for raising investments. And it's not only them, right? So there is a number of people around that are not part of the NUG, but that advise and that are around the NUG that develop other forms. For instance, they raise money through apps, right? Anything from programming of computer games through other apps, through where advertisement can then be sold. So all of that is going on, and that's a great way to raise money. And for the ministry itself, you're aware, of course, of the revolution bonds, which are bonds that have just that don't have any coupon, but it's just a promise of repayment without interest. And these have been largely successful, but there is, of course, limits in how much you can raise through these means, and these limits may be enough to sustain the revolution as it is, but it is not enough to put the administration on a sustainable footing in terms of being able to make sure that people who currently volunteer in in whichever form for the NUG, also at the center of government, will be able to continue doing that. And that's a problem in the medium term, and it's also a problem for a movement and a government that is currently still expanding what they do and expanding their services. At some point that needs to be addressed, and there is where actually partners that would be interested in this succeeding could come in.
Okay, so when you say partners, what are we talking? Are we talking about foreign governments? Are we talking about NGOs? Are we talking about private companies?
All of them.
All of them.
Your classical development partners. So, for instance, if you're a development partner and you fund humanitarian effort in the country, or a lot of development partners have now gone back to the 101 thing to do if you're in a difficult situation. You just start funding NGOs and CBOs. And the question is what is the absorption capacity there, and to which degree does that make sense? It's a different conversation. I don't want to go into that in much detail. But what you could do is, for instance, if you fund some of the service delivery that is being done by the NUG, there are ways of setting up your funding in such a way that you ensure also that you're funding the structures that deliver the services. So, and that's usually done in a development context. No, if you have a development project, you fund the delivery of a service, and that includes certain costs that are associated with it. And the cost for the NUG of delivering would be anything from central coordination to the actual delivery of the services on the ground. So that, to my knowledge, is not happening, and that's a problem. So you can always approach the NUG and you can say, you know what, we can give you an advisor to help you, draft this piece of policy, and that's happening, and that's fine. But ultimately, that's not enough. Ultimately, if you are interested in supporting service delivery in certain areas of the country, and you're interested in the success of the democratic movement in the country, and you're interested in the building of government structures, because let's face it, if you don't build the government structures of the NUG, the other structures of the regime, the current junta regime are atrophying, so good luck there. You should do this, and you can do this, and it's not impossible to do it even in a conventional development logic.
Interesting. And so this is just a new sort of area for me. I'm not familiar with how any of this would work. Like, is there a way for the NUG to start sort of marketing itself to development partners actively?
There could be. There could be. There are in the world of development. There are certain ways of let's put it this way: development partners in the last decades have realized that it's not always easy to fund or even productive to fund just what is the previously recognized structure or the previously effective structure. In these situations of fragility, there have been instruments that have been used by development partners to fund a plan for transformation, and post-conflict compacts, these kind of things, where funding of non-recognized entities against a certain framework or certain commitments for delivery would be possible. So, for instance, if you said as NUG you would produce an aid policy for the NUG, and you would lay out a framework where you would say, we are committed to meet certain benchmarks, and these could be negotiated with interested partners. For instance, we would commit to reform of the security sector post-conflict, or we would commit to certain targets in terms of human rights, independence of justice sector institutions when they're built, and you would agree on a roadmap and a framework, then this could be an effective tool maybe to attract more resources. So it can be encouraged. But I see right now, I see the major responsibility on development partners to do better. Because, we're not talking about huge amounts to start with. It's not about, the EU reinvesting all that direct budget support for the education sector, that hundreds of millions that have been spent there in the NUG schools. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about pilot things where you can explore with lower amounts how joint service delivery could happen, and you can do that in a project framework, and it's simple. Just start.
And so this, again, we're going into like sort of strange territory. I know the topic is the NUG's capacity, but I think this is a very fascinating direction to look at. When this money is given, when development partners come in, and the value that they add is, it's significant, right? If you suddenly have access to money, if you have access to resources, if you have access to expertise, and the ability to do things, that is huge. And I think, and I hope you would agree, Myanmar will need, not conditional, will need some sort of external assistance post-conflict, because we've seen large-scale devastation and destruction of agricultural land. We've seen the destruction of food stores. Food shortage is not going to go away. It's going to take a while to refill the petrol pumps, petrol wells, for example. Like the shortages of resources currently existing in the state are not going to disappear from one day to the next. The question that I want to pose, though, is what is the risk associated with this? Because there are certain actors within, certain even state actors within international development who have been noted for leading smaller, poorer countries into effectively debt traps and an endless cycle of repayments and using aid as just a way to funnel money back to their own people and their own companies. Is this something that Myanmar might be subject to, and does the NUG have the wherewithal to navigate that?
I don't know that would be a concern at this point in time. I don't think you will have large investments in infrastructure that are then not being done by multilateral development banks, but by large national banks, as has been the case in some countries that have found themselves recently have their infrastructure expropriated. I don't think that's a big issue. It's more about how to mobilize interest and how to mobilize the support, and less about, I think, any sort of debt trap, because the needs, as you say, are just staggering. You have, students in Myanmar right now, they're losing years worth of education. This is going to have an impact on the productivity in the future that may be enormous. Yeah. So, as you say, there will be need for long-term support and long-term, as you see, rehabilitation of basic infrastructure, but even beyond that, investment in education, investment in health. The progress that has been made in nutrition in the country surely is also receding, or is also being lost now. So right now, it's just about mobilizing the support that you can get. And I think that should be the priority is the priority of the NUG. I don't think I have to tell them what their priority is, but that is the priority. I wouldn't worry too much about these phenomena, to be quite frank.
Okay, well that's comforting at least. So I want to sort of look at the flip side of the coin. And going into this interview, I said that it might be somewhat controversial. You've made a very strong case for the legitimacy of the National Unity Government and the efficacy of the National Unity Government. But I want to talk about the limitations on the National Unity Government and the flaws associated with it. Certainly, the National Unity Government has not been immune from criticism domestically. And criticism from pro-military factions should not be surprising to us. It should also not be of any interest to us. But criticism from pro-democracy groups and pro-democracy individuals is something to note. And my initial question is just, I want to compare the National Unity Government to similar cases, to similar examples around the world. And I know that we've discussed this previously, and I still have not been able to find an example of any government that has formed under similar circumstances. And I just want to ask you again, have you been able to think of any government in history in any country that has formed under these circumstances?
No, I haven't. We've had this conversation. No, I can't. And it's quite remarkable what is being done in the circumstances. Also, the idea of you have the CDM, which used to be 400,000 strong. Nobody knows exactly what the numbers are now. The NUG presumably knows. They have a registry. But so of those 100,000, at least 10,000 are mobilized. So you have a volunteer bureaucracy of tens of thousands of people. Where does that exist? Or has that existed in history? So that's clear. When we talk about the limitations that you mentioned, or the criticism of the NUG, I think you have to divide between the criticisms that criticize the efficacy of the NUG in getting to consensus and delivering, and then there's the other criticism of the NUG maybe overstepping their boundaries and encroaching on other actors in the coalition. Mm-hmm. And so both of those criticisms are actually the same, well, different sides of the same coin, and they're somewhat in conflict or contradicting each other, because to be more effective, the NUG has to go ahead and do things and deliver services, and they are, especially when it comes to local government. Of course, in some cases, in some areas of the country, when you do that and when you start delivering and you start establishing local structures, you may not all the actors on the ground that are sympathetic to the general democratic movement, and we all know how broad the democratic movement is, that is also its strength, may not be happy with that. So, it's a bit of a situation of damned if you do and damned if you don't, but we need to remember that the NUG is a national unity government, and that is the situation that any national unity government finds itself in. And some of the criticisms I find a bit too harsh, because some of the criticism is actually not about the capacity of the NUG to do things, but it goes more to the fact that consensus is not easily to be had. And when we talk about finding consensus on, say, proposed policy, then there are other actors involved. There's certainly the parliament involved, the CRPH, the interim federal union parliament, if you want to call it that. And there's also the National Unity Consultative Council involved. And there have been really strong efforts on all sides, we have to say, to make this coordination work when it comes on, say, developing a common approach to what education should look like, delivered by different systems, right? Delivered by the ethnic revolutionary organization systems, delivered in schools that are run by the Ministry of Education, and so on and so forth. So this coordination is very, very difficult, and it would be extremely difficult in a national unity government in peacetime. This is very fluid. It's a conflict situation, pressure on all sides. Not everybody has been friends before they have found themselves to be allies. So I think it is to be expected. And I think one of the key priorities in the future for the NUG also as an executive government, but also the democratic movement more widely to be successful is to work on simplifying this conversation. Work on developing structures that allow decision making while still being inclusive, allow some sort of delegation, right? If you have a committee, have rules for the committee, have rules for membership on the committee, establish secure reporting lines, have a procedural framework on how things is done. I think the NUG internally is further in terms of developing that procedural framework. In the NUCC, I have my doubts. But that is what's needed.
Okay, so you've just touched on a lot of different things there. So,
yeah.
And I'm very glad that you have. But let's sort of take them sort of one step at a time, because there are problems in the national unity government. I don't think anybody is seriously suggesting that there aren't. But there's always a very big difference between problems of individual members versus problems of the actual structure of an organization versus problems of the infrastructure available to the organization. These are all very different types of issues. So let's first examine like what is even at play here. So the national unity government cabinet is made up of a few dozen people. But you mentioned the CRPH, which is the de facto parliament, so the legislature, and also the NUCC. How many people are we talking about here?
In the NUCC is made up of organizations, right? So there are delegates of different organizations that participate in the meetings. But in the NUCC, you would always have well over 100 people. In the CRPH, you have a bit over 20 people in any type of meeting, right? So if you want to have a decision-making body that needs to come to a decision with 120, 150 people, and you don't have a procedural framework, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and so and this is another question then with these meetings. Meetings are a hot button issue. We've seen memes being made on Burmese Facebook, seemingly pointing out and laughing at these endless stream of meetings and these promotional videos and footage that members of various democratic government entities are releasing on their social media to say, well, look at all these meetings we're attending, look at all the work that we're doing. These meetings, when you say CRPH, you've got about 20 people in a meeting, do those 20 people have the authority within the system to actually come to a conclusion at the end of their meeting, decide on a course of action, and have that implemented? Or is that meeting supposed to come to a resolution which is then presented to yet another meeting to be reevaluated by a different group of people?
If we talk specifically about the CRPH, then you can think of the CRPH as being, and this is an arrangement that is only in place at interim. You have that in other parliaments as well around the world. You have the CRPH being a manifestation of the wider parliament. So what happens is if a bill, say, is coordinated between the NUG and the NUCC, then comes to the legislature. CRPH's committees, there are committees in place. Parliamentary committees will meet and review the bill, and then it goes to CRPH, and then it is approved. And so at interim, it's then approved. And then there is the whole Pidang Suluto, like all the MPs that have been elected, they come together once every quarter to sometimes once every half year, and they go through these decisions and validate them. That's how it currently works. As said, that's not how our parliament would would always work in peacetime, but it is the closest you can get in the current situation to a parliamentary process. They also, by the way, receive the reports from the NUG and look at those reports. So the NUG actually reports on their performance to the CRPH. So there is this basic legitimacy that is there from the 2020 election, right? So we sometimes forget in all this debate that we actually have an elected parliament in Myanmar. And interestingly, I also think development partners have a bit moved on from that conversation. If you look at what some of the resolutions that have come out recently, everybody's talking about, the democratic organizations that are there, support to civil society, and so on. But as a matter of fact, we still have a clear, legitimate basis for CRPH as a parliament and the NUG as a responsible government, and then the NUCC as sort of a society-wide council. You could even think of it as the nucleus of a constituent assembly for the future, for designing the state of the future, and that's. If you read the Federal Democracy Charter, the NUCC is supposed to give guidance on the broad outlines of where the democratic movement and the democratic camp wants to go, what the future or the interim, as they say now, the interim or the transitional. Interim is now, transitional is the future. The transitional state of Myanmar, the federal state of Myanmar will look like, whereas policy and bills would come from the NUG, and the review and approval would be by the CRPH, and then the Federal Union Parliament, meaning the bigger body of all the elected MPs. So that's what it should be. In fact, the coordination between all these actors is challenging, as you've said, or as we've discussed before. And the sometimes lack of procedures that is in place makes it harder to come to consensus between, say, cabinet and sometimes the NUCC, or makes it take longer to process policy and process bills.
So, I mean, this is a substantial framework. I mean, yes, obviously, governance is a very complicated thing, but there are a lot of people involved, and you're saying to me that the legislature itself, will only meet and validate decisions quarterly, at best. That seems to be a reasonably slow pace of legislation. Is legislation actually important under the current situation? Like, is that really as relevant as it would be in a peacetime administration, or is it something that we can afford to delay for 3 months or 6 months?
Well, the way it's being now is that it comes into that the legislation is considered to be in effect as soon as it's approved by CRPH, which is the core group that meets more regularly, right? And then the validation comes later. But it's a good point to ask whether legislation has the same effect as it has in peacetime. I would suggest policy is indeed at this point more important than legislation, which is an implementing tool for policy. The question right now is to get the overall policy right for the current interim framework. Sometimes, the aim of that policy is also to look forward to the transitional period. But by no means should there be an understanding that whatever transitional or interim, for instance, education policy should be the final solution for the future of Myanmar, because it's not the current period will come to an end, and if the revolution is successful, then a whole new situation will open up, and new actors will be in the next iteration of the NUG, because presumably other entities in the country, other EROs, other political entities, maybe in the future, other political parties, will then want to have a say. So what is now is a bit short term, and it needs to serve the interests of now.
Yeah, and moving forward, I definitely do want to move on at some point to asking about the future and the transition from the current state of affairs into a more stable state of affairs. But in the interest of genuinely sort of understanding what is going on right now and what the limitations are of the current system, I want to take it back to the comment you just made, saying that policy is more important than legislation in the current context. So policy comes from the National Unity Government. The cabinet of the National Unity Government is reasonably small. In terms of actual number of ministries, I think there are probably only about a dozen or so, maybe a little bit more than that in terms of the actual number of ministries. And cabinet meets as per usual, and then the ministers and the deputy ministers go back to their ministries, and they will have meetings with their staff to implement that policy. I mean, that is the mechanism within the National Unity Government. It is the mechanism that we see in most countries. This is not an unusual system. Is the National Unity Government effective in this workflow, however?
Internally, reasonably, I would say. There is so what you have normally in a government, in a central coordination framework. There is, as you say, there is cabinet. What is missing is a very well developed cabinet office that is not currently in place, and that's just for lack of resources and lack of staff. So the preparation of cabinet decisions is not as elaborate as you would have it in a established government in peacetime. You know, the rules for how a policy should look like when it comes to cabinet, the rules for what is the state of preparation of a topic when it comes to cabinet. Because, you know, in general, cabinet is an ultimate decision-making body. Cabinet is not a body for discussing. So in theory, or in general practice, anything that is not ready for decision should not come to cabinet. So in terms of how the preparation of matters that come before cabinet, the structures are not yet fully there. In terms of the fact that a policy is developed by a ministry, and then there are rules in place for how this is discussed in cabinet, and then how this is decided on by cabinet, that is in place. So the basic structures are there. Importantly, also, there are reporting frameworks in place, meaning the center of government has the ability to know what is being implemented of that policy, right? So the ministries have reporting frameworks in place that go down to township level, right? Things are usually implemented on the ground, township level. The information comes back up and is then sent to the center of government and analyzed there. Now, this is not perfect, but the basic process of A, policy making, and then B, the instruments for policy implementation, and C, the reporting on both the policy, so the narrative side, and also the financial side. All of that is in place.
Okay, so that sounds reasonably good. But you mentioned in previously in this interview that there is criticism regarding the NUG's ability to implement policy. So the way you explain it, I mean, it sounds very reasonable. You would say the workflow is basically generally correct. People are not acting as efficiently as they could be acting, but the basic principle is there, there are layers of sort of verification and accountability built into the system to ensure that nobody goes sort of off the rails. And yet, even if that's the case, and even if we can look at the National Unity Government and say, well, okay, yeah, you're doing the best that you can under the circumstances that you have to deal with, if there is criticism from within Myanmar, from within the pro-democracy faction of the National Unity Government, whether real or perceived, lack of ability to deliver on promises being made, lack of ability to act quickly, and certainly we've seen a lot of sort of chatter. It's become part of the online culture in a sense to sort of understand that bad things will happen and the National Unity Government will not act on those things. Or if they act, it will be very, very delayed, or it will be very muted. And basically this sense of, well, yeah, asking the National Unity Government to fix these problems is sort of an inside joke. Is there a threat that they can start losing the support of the people if they don't make an effort to appear more effective and more decisive in their implementation of policy?
I mean, that threat is always there, right? You're absolutely right. You are in a situation that's very difficult for all the actors involved, including the top political level, so the ministers of the NUG, but also the volunteers, advisors, and everybody else working with them. I think that danger is absolutely there. One of the problems that I see is again one of resources. So I think I mentioned before a bit this culture of sacrifice, the idea that whatever resources incoming is only invested into the things that I've mentioned: CDM, service delivery, mostly humanitarian assistance, and the defense effort, which is understandable, but it goes to such a degree that whatever funds that are being centrally created and used by, say, the Ministry of collected and used by the Ministry of Planning, Finance and Investment, and that are then transferred to the individual ministries, are also used exclusively for these purposes. There's no investment in building further and institutionalizing these coordination structures that we've just discussed. And the culture of sacrifice also prevents that. I've had conversations with people working inside the ministries where I've asked them, okay, so you're spending all your time with this, but what about your livelihood? And they will say, no, I don't want to discuss this. This is not something. We all need to make sacrifices. I said, but will you be able to sustain yourself? I don't want to discuss this. So there is this culture of sacrifice that may actually be inhibiting institutional progress because resources into the ability to administer and become more effective are not allocated. And that's where I see a big role also for development partners to come in with resources. And I mean financial resources, but I also mean technical assistance to, what makes this government run as a government. And that would help the effectiveness. It can't solve the political issues. The political issues need to be solved by the actors on the ground. And if the political issues, as you've alluded to, are not solved by the actors on the ground, yes, ultimately any government will lose support. But at least on the institutional side, much can be improved with a little bit of support.
And so this is something that you just mentioned a couple of times, the sacrifice element. And I want to read, notionally back to you, but for the benefit of the audience, I want to read from an article that you published, that you also sent me, Myanmar NLD at 33, which we will also link below this podcast. And these two paragraphs here that you've written, I think, really do help contextualize it. The NLD endured 2 decades in the underground because it was able to develop the structures of a mass political party. These included a strong central administration, topping a pyramid structure of party branches in states and regions, districts, townships, all the way down to ward and village tracts, Myanmar's lowest tier of public administration, and an unrivaled internal coherence based on a culture of sacrifice. Quote, "We gathered some people who were really active, and they decided through semi-democratic voting, electing the people with the most prominent history of activism and the most sacrifices," end quote. Uan Ji-nyut, NLD Central Executive Committee member and now CRPH chair. Now, this is something that you've mentioned in this interview, something that you've written about before, this culture of sacrifice. And it seems like this is something that is not just part of the political reality of Myanmar, but is part of many Myanmar people's view of the world and view of what they have to do in order to achieve progress, in order to liberate themselves from the military. They have to make sacrifices. They have to give whatever they can to support the PDF, to support the CDM, to support the NUG, to support whatever the case may be. And I know this is not a topic that you want to delve into too deeply, but I do want to just touch on it. Do you feel that the culture of sacrifice is net beneficial, or is the focus on sacrifice getting in the way a little bit of planning more efficiently?
Both.
Okay.
Without that culture of sacrifice, there wouldn't be a CDM. There wouldn't be, and I'm not talking about, you specifically quoted the article about the NLD. I think that applies to political culture in Myanmar in general, and the culture that underpins the democratic aspirations of the country, and that's lived experience. We don't have to go into the history of Myanmar. I mean, your listeners will know. So without that culture, I don't think any of this would have happened. I don't think the CDM would have been as strong. Definitely the CDM would not have endured, because look at what happens in other countries when repression hits. Things just go away. And it's entirely normal to go away. And the fact that it's still there, this volunteer basis of the NUG as an administrative apparatus and as a government is still there, is because of that culture. The fact that seniority is very much valued, and the track record of suffering, or the track record of sacrifice, is then a political factor in determining career chances and in determining a seniority and the rise to a position of power, and whether that gets in the way of getting the people who will be most suited to the current situation or to the role in question. I'm sure that's a factor. I'm sure that's a factor across all the organizations in the country. But it's also quite normal. It's just an extreme way of selecting people for higher political office that is very normal in all other countries in the world as well. I mean, people don't usually get to be the minister because they're the best suited. They get to be the minister because they've invested a significant time in working inside their party. And yes, they may be smart, and yes, they may be suited, but that's how it works. And in Myanmar's history of extreme politics, it is this culture of sacrifice, I think, that gives you the street cred to rise up, and gives you also the respect of the people.
Fair enough. And so with that, let's move to another sort of topic that you touched upon. You said that the fundamental criticisms of the National Unity Government are divided into basically the perceived failure to deliver on policy and the perception of the NUG's overreach. Now, that largely, from my perception, I may be wrong, but that seems to largely occur within the debate around federalism and the role that a central Myanmar government will now and will post-coup or post-conflict play in the administration of non-ethnic Burma regions and the expectations that a lot of these border regions have, both currently and in the future, of autonomy. Can you provide a little bit of context for what the conflict, not conflict, but the disagreements and the criticisms are with regard to this perceived overreach?
I don't think we should over dramatize this. Just as a qualifier, I think these are concerns that are being raised on the ground when speaking to people that they feel that sometimes, for instance, especially it came in when I spoke to people, it came from some of these state interim consultative councils, right? The nucleus for the future state governments. Some factions in that, not all factions, that said, we want to be federal in the future, but at the same time, the NUG just goes ahead and does things. But they shouldn't. They should let us do it. And that may be a fair aspiration to have, but the counterparts that have noted this to me were all at the same time saying, yes, we're in the process of establishing our state government, but we can't agree among each other at this point. So we'll stay as a committee. And we also don't have staff to support the committee. So at one point, many people say, look, they're going ahead and they're not consulting us. And at the same time, the question is, if they don't go ahead, then will they be criticized for not being effective? And if they consulted that faction, would it be the same outcome? Would it be as effective as it could be? So my point is, yes, there are these criticisms, and yes, some of them may be justified, but very often the NUG is in a situation where damn if you do, damn if you don't, right? Mm-hmm. So if you consult everybody, you're not going to get things done. If you get things done, you will alienate some people. And I think in the short term, it's pretty clear anyway where the NUG local administrations are strongest. That's in the central countries, and then in the country in the central part of the country, and then in the states in former Kaya state or in Kaya state and in Chin state, where the local structures are of, or the ethnic and ethnic political party and ERO led political structures are not as consolidated, and that there's a bit of overlap in terms of the administration. There it needs to be resolved, but I think these issues are not so much in those areas where it's clear who is in control of the structure. So I don't think these issues are the same when we talk about the ethnic Karen structures, right? Versus the NUG structures. So it's more a question of at the fringes. In the longer run, though, and that's something that has to be resolved in the transition, the question needs to be resolved of, whose administration, and that should be resolved based on what service is delivered by what level of government to the best way. And that is a debate that's not been had at this point in time and needs to be had more. So less debate about aspirations and more debate about getting things done would probably be useful. And then maybe the criticism would be more valid in my view, and that's my very personal view.
And definitely, I don't want to sort of make it sound as though you're necessarily speaking for entire organizations. So I just want to clarify, with these problems that arise, the conflict that the NUG is faced with, implement a policy but then upset some people whose toes you stood on, versus don't implement the policy, engage with these people but then face the backlash for inaction.
To a certain degree, those are normal issues, right? As you say, and as you alluded to in your question. But of course, in peacetime state, you have institutions and you have polities where things are already done in a certain way. And sometimes, in some of the more mature federal states that we all know, the problem is actually reforming a system because it has been it has ossified and nobody can reform it anymore. Can give you an example from my country. It's really weird that protection of youth is the mandate of 9 states and not a federal mandate in my country, and it's been a huge issue. But you can't change it anymore. So and there, coordination is always an issue, and fighting between the federal unit and the national unit and the union is always an issue, and there are usually also constitutional courts or tribunals to resolve this. So that's normal, as you say, but it's of course harder in the current situation because the pressure is there constantly, pressure for survival, security pressure, and communication is really difficult, and the demands physically, health, psychologically on all the actors are overwhelming. So I think these are just very, very difficult issues that can't be easily resolved now. If you ask what my opinion is at this point in time, it's more important to do. But definitely in the medium run, these things need to be resolved, and it's not gonna happen overnight. I also don't think we should expect that any transition that results is gonna happen and be done overnight. This will take time.
So that really sort of neatly segues into the sort of last focus that I want to have in this interview, which is looking to the future. And I know inherently that this calls very heavily for speculation, and we cannot make any firm statement on what the future holds. I don't know. Maybe you would agree, maybe you would disagree. I don't think that many of the stakeholders involved in Myanmar right now have really started firmly considering what is going to happen post-conflict. The focus really is just on getting to the end of the conflict and trying to defeat the military. But what do you think, assuming victory comes, and fortunately that is increasingly looking more likely, what do you think is going to be the next step? Will the NUG simply stand down and say, all right, now we're going to have a fresh wave of elections? Or will they implement their own transition period? What do you think would happen?
Well, there is in the Federal Democracy Charter a roadmap towards the transition, and the roadmap isn't very well. In a sense, it is very detailed because it has many steps, but it isn't very clear on what exactly will happen. But there is an understanding, I think, among all actors that once this is won, there has to be a transition phase that has to accommodate more interests than are currently being accommodated inside that coalition. So the interim unity government will make way for a transitional unity government. And in my mind, that will actually be an expansion of the cabinet and maybe reshufflement of the cabinet, but it won't probably change the structures that are being built now and the practices that are being built now. So even with a view to a transitional situation, it's important to strengthen the structures that are in place now for administration. You will not have the whole NUG based on tens of thousands of CDMers being tossed aside and replaced with something entirely new. That is just not practical, and it's not possible. Yeah. So you are creating institutions, and these institutions will remain. Now, the way these institutions may be structured, or who controls politically which aspect, and which mandate will be devolved to or which policy area will be devolved to which level of administration, that is up for discussion. But these institutions are now the institutions, and I think they will remain to a certain degree. Yeah. You have, of course, then the situation of the structures that are still in place, the part of the civil service that is still in place, and now controlled by the SAC. So you will see a need to accommodate many of the civil servants. You will need to see a pragmatic approach to integration, right? The thing is, or the good thing is that, the CDM essentially is still organized in the institutional boundaries that are there. Yeah, so they haven't torn everything up and reorganized. No, the networks that were there before inside the CDM, so for instance for the Ministry of Education, still the same networks. Yeah, there's a new culture of working, as a more democratic culture, but there is continuity. Yeah. It's not out of thin air that this administration has built. There is a certain continuity. That is a good thing for the transition.
Absolutely, but it will inevitably. It is going to be a difficult transition. Like the amalgamation, as you alluded to, of the government departments that are under the control of the SAC and the government departments that are being run by the National Unity Government. There appears to be, and this is an issue that has been sort of flagged multiple times by certain ministries, like the Ministry of Home Affairs and Immigration, that there will be penalties for civil servants who refuse to join the civil disobedience movement. Now, do you feel that is going to happen? Do you feel that those people are going to be completely disenfranchised as the threats have been made? And if so, is that going to strip the civil structures, the civil infrastructure of Myanmar of people who maybe have indispensable organizational knowledge?
Look, no. It's too many people. Look, I can give you an example. I'm Austrian. We've had a Nazi regime, as you know, in Austria, many collaborators with the Nazi regime. And we had the same issue. We then had a democratic republic, and we had so many collaborators. So what happened was these people were disenfranchised for one election. In the civil service, nobody lost their job. And they have been reintegrated in society, and the same will happen also. Also, we shouldn't forget that not everybody who is still in the civil service is an absolute partisan of the junta. In fact, most people most likely aren't. They all used to vote NLD anyway in the past. So, A, can most people be integrated? And B, for political reasons and for sheer numbers, you have to reintegrate these people. And that will be done, or will need to be done, and it will be done, because there's no way around it.
Yeah, I think it's something that makes sense. It's quite evident when you think about the logistics that would be involved, and the threats that are made are very high-level threats of having to repay all of the salary that they received during the coup period, and being barred from civil service, being barred from having a passport, being barred from entering universities and educational institutions for 5 years, 10 years, and so on. Just the paperwork around the implementation of these threats would alone, be a huge draw on the administrative capabilities of the system. And on top of that, the fact that many people who have not joined the CDM have not joined the CDM because they cannot afford to go to jail because their families would starve if they did. So it's a very difficult system. So you're saying that you see a roadmap forward to reintegration and to steal from the South African system, truth and reconciliation. Would that be an accurate description? Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And so moving on to the bigger issue which we discussed before, specifically the issue of federalism. So you've mentioned the roadmap in the Federal Democracy Charter. How clear of an idea does it give us? Like, what is the scope for disagreement over what the Federal Democracy Charter actually says between different stakeholders?
You mean implied in the way it's phrased itself? It's quite open. It's specific on steps, but it's quite unspecific on certain areas. So, for instance, anytime something is not clearly stated as a union prerogative in the Federal Democracy Charter or federal government prerogative, it is said it will be resolved at the state level through state autonomy. So it's actually quite open what that will mean. And I think it has to be open at this point in time because as we just noted, currently what you need to legislate for or make policy for is the interim and the beginning of the transition period. Once the regime is defeated, you will have so many actors that need to be accommodated. All of our kind needs to be accommodated. You have a lot of organizations in the Northeast that are de facto independent already that at least you need to try to accommodate. There are political parties that are maybe sympathetic but haven't come forward. There are parties that may not be sympathetic and are quietly sitting on their hands. So you need to leave certain flexibility as to what the future will look like in terms of what is at the union level, what is at the level of the states, and then the debate that hasn't been had enough, I think, is one of local governance. Because if you look at the weakest part, I think, in Myanmar's governance system was always local governance. Myanmar always had local administration and never a local government. You know? I mean, it had community level representation through the ward and village tract administrators, and that's fine. But there was never local government. And some of the big questions around who has nominal control of what and what will future boundaries of the countries, of the internal boundaries and administrative divisions and so look like, are probably best resolved at the local level. So these are the things that you cannot discuss right now because you can't make that decision. It is something that, yes, you can plan for having the conversation. You can sort out basic guiding lines and basic points of agreement, but it would be, in my mind, detrimental to have it all worked out by now because you have to rip it up anyway. And once you have it all worked out, you're very reluctant to rip it up for somebody else you need to accommodate. And
so the $1 million question here is, because everyone's going to have their own version. Everyone has their own idea of what should happen. And some people would say, well, we want, very strong state administration. Some people would say, no, we want devolution of power, as low down to the community level as possible. This has to come out, like this has to be put on the table, and there are going to be some very heated debates. And no matter what you do, like to borrow a phrase that you've used quite a few times tonight, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like no one is going to come up with a plan that's going to keep everybody happy. So is there potential for the disagreements over exactly what federalism would mean, the disagreement between state level administration, federal administration, local administration, to to stymie the efforts to actually successfully transition into a new government, whatever government that might be?
Can't hear you now. I have no idea how to answer this, to be quite frank. That is a very good question.
And it does call for a lot of speculation. So
it's very speculative. I don't know. The question is, and let me paraphrase it maybe so that I'm sure I understand it correctly. The question is whether the current infighting that's there about what is the future of federalism, whether that will be problematic in terms of the transition and how to get to consensus to find a new form of transitional institutional arrangements, etc. That's it, right?
Or more to the point, I'm not quite asking about the current infighting. Rather, I'm asking about whether the fact that nobody has actually written it down in black and white in firm and certain terms is going to lead to infighting once the military has been taken out of the picture.
Well, there is already, to a certain degree, there are problems over the understanding of federalism. And Myanmar's history is riddled with conflicts about what federalism actually means, even between those actors that have committed to federalism. There is, and I'm not an expert on this, but there is a sense that all the states that will be forming out of these interim councils that are in place in the different states, they're also all working away on their own constitutions. And many of those actors that are working away on these constitutions already have developed constitutions in the early 2000s. And so they want to draw heavily on those. And then the question is, if you have these state constitutions as a nucleus, to which degree are these state constitutions that are being developed compatible with each other, and what do they imply for the federal level, right? So it's actually quite an organic way of building a federal union when you do it from the bottom up. I think whatever the final form of an agreement would be, we'll probably see, and I think that's consensus, very, very limited and very, very light touch federal government that does only what needs to be done, meaning defense, meaning monetary policy, meaning foreign policy, meaning the coordinating development assistance, all of that, and probably not much more.
Do you think environmental policy and protection would be federal?
Well, it should be, but I'm not sure. I think everything's on the table. That's the thing. Everything, and then in the transition, when more actors come to the table, then everything will have to be in the table. You will probably have a very, very federalized future.
Okay, that's interesting.
At least that is the aspiration. Whether that will work in a country that has a history of very centralized institutions is another matter. But that is I think the aspiration.
Fair enough. And so we've actually gone pretty far afield in some of these. The initial topic is just, is the NUG in a position to be able to effectively govern? And I think we've covered a lot with regard to their internal structures and with regard to a view to the future of Myanmar post-conflict and how that might turn out. Obviously, nobody knows for sure. But I definitely think we've covered a lot of very valuable ground. But as is our custom here, I want to finish off with any thoughts that you might have that you want to leave the audience with, anything that you want the audience to go away mulling over in their minds, or any message that you think is a very important takeaway from the discussion that we've had today or from the work that you've done previously.
I think there's one thing that I've continuously tried to highlight in the work that I've done, and it is all the criticism that can be labeled at, and I'm not only talking about the NUG, but all the other actors that are there in the Democratic Coalition, the criticisms of the NUCC, the criticism of the CRPH. What we should do is think about the alternatives to this. What is the alternative to this succeeding? You will not have elections in 2023 that will produce another transition. You will not have a state, and that is my honest assessment. You will not have a state that's anywhere close to the boundaries of Myanmar right now. You will not have regional stability. So whenever we judge what the democratic actors do with their limited resources, we should also look at what the junta regime doesn't do and is incapable of doing. They're not just bad because they're evil, they're bad because they're incompetent. And that is something that I think should be more worrying to countries that frankly don't really care as much about the rights of the people, or that are less liberally minded and more interested in economic stability. Just think about how spectacularly bad this junta is at governing. And then with that in mind, I think anybody in a position of decision making in a sympathetic country can maybe make a better case about why support to the NUG and the coalition partners of the NUG is a good thing right now.
I know for a lot of podcast listeners, as soon as the fundraising requests start up, you kind of just zone out and skip ahead till it's over. But I ask that if you've taken the time to listen to our full podcast, that you also take the time to consider our spiel. Some may assume that producing a 2-hour episode wouldn't take much more time than the conversation itself. But so much goes into it. In advance of the interview, our content team reviews the biography and relevant works of the upcoming guest, and we discuss the best way to use our limited time together. After the interview is complete, the raw audio file is sent to our sound engineer, who shapes it into working order. A single episode can take several full days of solid production work in the studio, which is then carefully coordinated with our content team to ensure smooth listening. Further edits and post-production magic bring the eventual episode to your ears, along with extensive written descriptions of each interview, which we publish on our blog and on social media as well. Many of these steps require an outlay of funds in some way or another. We hope that each episode helps to inform you about the ongoing crisis, and if you find it of value, we also hope that you can consider supporting our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support. perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Chalo ya ji ya me, ngado tan dwe min chani o ma.